It's my pleasure today to introduce a gentleman who I've known for several years, and I had a whole list of things to say about him, but he sent me a much more modified version, so since we're on a time limit, I'll just give you what he gave me. First of all, he wants to thank everybody who sat in the back and made him feel at home. Sorry, Monsignor, I couldn't pass that up. Monsignor Jason Gray was ordained a priest in the Diocese of Peoria in 1997. He has a degree in biblical theology and a doctorate in canon law. He has served different parishes in this diocese, including St. Vincent de Paul Parish in Peoria, and currently is pastor of St. Thomas in Peoria Heights. He works in the diocesan offices as judicial vicar of the tribunal and executive director of the Sheen Foundation. From 2012 to 2015, he was released to serve the Congregation of the Causes of the Saints in Rome. Very well-studied man, good guy, and he's going to talk a little bit about Bishop Sheen and his path to sainthood, just a little bit there, and he's going to branch off into a few other things about Bishop Sheen. So, Monsignor Jason Gray.
Yeah, I know one of the things that people would like to talk about a little bit is the cause itself, and I'm happy to do that. Although I thought as far as doing something that might be timely and something that's interesting, I thought let me take on what Sheen would say about communism. And because one of the things he was well known for was his speaking about communism, and I thought I might even so forget myself as to wade into what Sheen might say if he were here today about politics. Okay, oh, that's dangerous. Okay, but I'm a risky man, so I'm ready to take that on. Just a little bit about Bishop Sheen. I know a lot of people might be familiar with him. He was born in 1895 in El Paso, Illinois, so local to us here. He was ordained at the same cathedral that we have today. I was ordained there in 97. He was ordained there in 1919. But he was soon taken off to Washington, D.C. and New York. He spent a lot of time doing radio programs called the Catholic Hour, but is probably most known from 1952 to 1957 for his appearance on television in Life is Worth Living, so for which he won an Emmy. He also spent time promoting the missions as the director of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. That was a big part of his work for the church, promoting the missions. He also served at the Second Vatican Council as one of the bishop members, and also as Bishop of Rochester, New York, before he retired. He died in 1979. Just a brief history about Fulton Sheen. And there's information about Sheen actually on some of the cards that you see in front of you. And if you're interested in any of that information or stopping by the cathedral where Sheen is now buried, so his body is entombed at the cathedral, and also the Sheen Museum is just a block away in the Pastoral Center. So if you're interested in learning more about that, there's plenty of information around. So just a few things, and I'll say something about the cause. I might just kind of wait till the end. I'll just kind of run through this relatively quickly to give you more time to ask the questions that you might want to ask. Hopefully, at least this comment about what he said about communism in the 50s and the 60s is helpful, and maybe what I would speculate he would say if he were here today. So I'll run through that quickly, and hopefully it gives us some encouragement. This is all positive. This is actually a good thing. First, one of the things that is characteristic about Sheen is he read so broadly, and he also thought critically. And boy, that's such an important thing. And I think that's part of what made him successful on television. So when he talked about reading broadly, he would talk about reading not just the Bible, not just spiritual books, not just theology. He read things including literature, science, the philosophy of politics, in a word, everything that would be useful for a priest in instructing or discoursing with others. That's one of the things that helped it in Life is Worth Living, because he was speaking not just simply to a Catholic audience. He had broad appeal. He was known to the Jewish community, the Protestants, the Catholics. So many people would make Life is Worth Living must-see TV during that time in the 50s, and it's because he wasn't necessarily starting from the point of view of the Catholic Church alone. He would speak from common experience and then draw people to Jesus Christ. So that was a technique that he had. One of the things that he always wanted to do is, and he said, these are both quotes from his autobiography, said, I would like to know two things. First, what the modern world is thinking about. So he wanted to address the world as it currently stands, and then how to answer the errors of modern philosophy in the light of St. Thomas Aquinas. This is what Sheen himself said part of his mission was. So he was ready to speak to the modern world. In particular, with respect to communism, he was very well read. So he didn't just simply read the Bible and theology. He read Karl Marx. He read the Constitution of the Soviet Union. So he was very familiar with the thinking of Karl Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. And he would quote them themselves. So this wasn't just him saying what he thought. He was quoting some of these different thinkers. So when he talked about communism, he would quote Karl Marx, who would say that communism teaches that man is alienated from his true nature by religion and private property. If only mankind could get rid of religion and private property. These are the two things keeping man from being free. This is religion makes man a subservient of God. Karl Marx didn't like that. Private property makes man a subject to his employer. He didn't believe in that. And so communism will set you free. If man is to be free, religion and private property, this is Karl Marx, must be destroyed, which is why communism and atheism are inseparable. So he would speak of some of these things, quoting directly from these sources. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of Sheen's life is he did say something about Stalin. He opened his program in 1953, a particular program in which he was talking about Stalin, and he spoke about Stalin as dead. He then spoke about the death of Stalin. And he actually used a very famous soliloquy that appears in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, in which Mark Antony, and this is based on real events, Mark Antony stands up to eulogize Julius Caesar, and it's there at Caesar's funeral that Mark Antony gives the speech, which actually changes the whole mood of the Roman Empire at that time. You might remember the famous phrase, friends, Romans, country. Well, he started, friends, Soviets, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Stalin, not to praise him. What happened? Within a couple weeks, Stalin actually died, and he had people calling him from around the country saying, who told you? How did you know? He said, I knew only that he was mortal and he would have to pay the last penalty of sin, which was death. He said it was a coincidence, but this is one of the ways in which I think so often Sheen was thought of as very prescient. He could read the signs of the times and speak to them. So Sheen was certainly no communist and was not favorable to communism. So that meant he was a capitalist, right? Not so fast, okay, because he was also quick to criticize capitalism. And this is where I think we have in Sheen a very, very interesting person. So just because he would see the deficits in communism, that didn't mean that capitalism is automatically a panacea, because he says there are dangers there when we become too focused on profit or on product over the human person. And so he would have his criticisms there. Not quite as strong as his criticisms of communism, but nonetheless, he was quick to point out what he saw as shortcomings into which we could fall in both cases. And many times we talk about being free. Remember what Karl Marx said. We have to be free from the influences of religion or of private property that are corrupting us. But as Sheen would point out, he says you can't be free from something unless you're also ready to answer the question, then what are you free for? To be free from something, I've been set free, but now what are you going to do with that freedom? You have to answer the question, then what is freedom for? He would say it is so important for us to balance our personal rights, also the rights of the individual with the good of society. To keep them both in balance is to stand in between this dialectic between communism and capitalism. Sheen would hold that we need to focus on both things, and that's so important. So what would Sheen say if he were here today? Now this is that. So far I've just been quoting Sheen. Everything I said appears in his writings. I'm going to now try to channel Sheen and say, if he were here today, here's what I think he would say. Because the names change, the titles change. What you say about the left, what you say about the right, it's not exactly the same as it was even in the 60s. So things have changed, perspectives have changed. If he were looking at the world today, I think he would say that the left wants to hold up certain values, that we should be free from certain things. What should we be free from? Free from poverty. Poverty is an evil. Let me not be poor. We should also be free from slavery. Slavery is a very common thing you hear in politics. Let me not be oppressed. Let me be free from discrimination. Let society not be prejudiced. And these are all noble things. So this is, in fact, a good thing. We can say it is good for us, in fact, to try to mitigate financial or economic hardship, oppression, or being unfairly judged. These are all noble goals for which we aspire, and I think Sheen would hold those things up. However, now let me walk through a little bit of an extreme. Now I'm going to take some of these things and push them out to their limits. And admittedly, I'm not speaking for any one politician or any specific political movement, but let's just go through a thought exercise in which we just take this out all the way to its end. Freedom from poverty. So we should work against economic hardship. It's a good thing. And so if we were to then continue on from there, well, then no one should have to work in order to survive. People should be taken care of. Poverty should not hold them back. So if I don't actually have to work, well, what's the danger there? It can actually lead towards sloth or laziness, which can become tolerated. That's the danger of taking to the extreme, the idea that we should then work against poverty. We can become jealous of those who have, and that's a great danger in which we're pit one against another. I don't have, so I'm now jealous of the person who does have. They shouldn't have. I should take from those who have, and what we end up with is a selfishness, a man-centered selfishness. Now, this is taken to the extreme of something that can be a noble goal, but when pushed to the extreme can get us into danger. Let me do another one. Let's talk about slavery. Slavery is not a good thing. So it is, in fact, noble that we free people from unjust oppression, but let's now push that out as far as we can. So that means that if I should not be a slave to anyone, that means no one can tell me what to do. So pushing that out to the farthest possible extreme. So if no one can tell me what to do, I get to do what I want. If I get to do what I want, then I can define for myself what I should do. It becomes self-indulgent. What happens there? We become filled with hatred toward anyone who wants to impose a limit. Hatred toward anyone who wants to impose upon me any restrictions, and we end up with a man-centered individualism. There is a danger. There's a danger that happens there. Let's try one more. Let's take the third example that I gave, discrimination. Discrimination is not a good thing, so we don't want to unjustly discriminate people. We should not pass judgment. Judge not, yet lest ye be judged. And so that's a noble thing. So pushing further, then society. Who is society to tell me what to do? We should live in a society in which no one then judges me, in which society that does not pass judgment. Pushing that out further, that means that if society is not going to be judgmental, then any behavior whatsoever becomes tolerated, and you can see a kind of decline or social decadence. Admittedly, this is pushing things to the extreme in doing this, but there is the danger that happens if we lose our way from moral principles that are rooted in God. If we reject all social norms, then we end up with a utopia in which we all get to live in a completely judgment-free zone. So it's a man-made utopia, but it is apart from God, and that's in fact something very different. So I've just taken three principles that we could say from the perspective of the left, and I think the way Sheen might kind of dress that up. He would do it, I'm sure he would do a much better job than I did, but that's my interpretation of how he would take those things. What do we do with material goods? That's where we say, well, we should be free from poverty. What do we do about ourselves? We should be free from slavery. I should be personally free. What about our society? Should be free from discrimination. And so we can think from that perspective, and you push those all the way out to the farthest left extreme possible. I was suggesting we get further and further away from God. If we do that, then we end up in a man-centered place, which is not always a good place. But let's say, what would happen if we used our freedom for something? How should we use our freedom with respect to material goods, with respect to ourselves, with respect to society? So let me play the same game, but I'm going to now do this from the perspective on the right. Remember that Sheen wasn't necessarily automatically siding with capitalism just because he was criticizing communism. But let's take the most noble aspects of the right. What would we say on the opposite side of the argument? That you would say we should be free for? We should be free for productivity, industry, entrepreneurship, to be able to use our skills. Let me be free to labor for my personal interests. What about ourselves? We should be free to be self-reliant. So let me take responsibility for myself. Let me strive for excellence. Let me then be the best that I can be. Or we should strive for patriotism in our society. That means let me be free to advance the virtues of our society. All noble goals. And all three of these things, I would say, are noble, and it is in fact a good thing for us to be free to cultivate the fruits of our labor, using the material goods that we have, to take personal responsibility for ourselves, and to work for a virtuous society. These are all good things. So all of these are noble goals. Just like in their beginnings, what I was describing on the left and on the right. They're all noble goals, but now let me play the same game at which instead of poverty, let me talk about productivity and so forth, working through each of these three things. But now let me push them out to the extreme. Let me push all the way to the farthest right that they can go, and what happens? So if we take that freedom for productivity, meaning that we should be free to in an entrepreneurial sense, we should be free to cultivate the fruits of our labor. Well, that means that we can do what we wish with our things. We should be free to do that. We should be free to use our goods in the way that we want. That can tend, in a negative sense, towards selfishness or greed, valuing profit over people. That would be the worst case. And that's not to say that that speaks for any one particular politician or movement, but that would be the danger. The danger that we start to then value that profit or what we can do, what we say with our things, to value that over people. It can then lead to miserliness, lack of concern for those without, and what ends up? We end up with selfishness. Oddly enough, it's the same thing that I said in the other perspective. We end up thinking selfishly. I'm poor, you should give to me in a selfish way. I'm rich, I should be able to do what I want. And in both cases, it ends up in selfishness, is my suggestion. Let me take another example. Let me take the idea of what we do with ourselves. So we want to be free from slavery, but let us be free for self-reliance, to take personal responsibility. It is, in fact, good that we take responsibility for our actions, that we are responsible for what we do. So what do we say about that? Well, that means that we have to own that ourselves. No one else can take that responsibility for us. But we have a duty then to use that responsibility wisely. It might lead us then to pushing that out to the extreme, to pass judgment on those that are irresponsible. Well, they should take better care of themselves. That's what they should do. So if they're not going to take care of themselves, is that my responsibility now to take care of them if they won't do for themselves? It can lead to pride or self-righteousness, a lack of concern for others, and it can end up in radical man-centered individualism. That's the danger, pushing it so far out that we become so individually focused if we lose sight from God. Let me take one more, then the idea of patriotism. So we should be free for patriotic virtue, to cultivate that virtue, to promote a virtuous society. This is a noble goal. Let me push that further out, and by pushing it out and pushing it away from God, per se, we're kind of taking just the patriotism per se as its own end for its own sake. So societal virtue then is found in the principles of patriotism. This is a virtuous society. We see that that virtue is embedded within those patriotic ideals. It can lead to national pride, even perhaps a canonization of patriotic values, meaning we make the country into its own final end. If we do that apart from God, and that's what would happen here, then we may become boastful and arrogant, focusing on our own utopia, a utopia in which we define that for ourselves in its national end apart from God. So what am I suggesting? So here we have, in each of these cases, I'm taking material goods, and here's how the left would look at it, is I need to be free from this negative. The right would look at it as to be free for this positive. But the problem is that push both to the extreme, and if you take God out of the picture, both end in either man-centered selfishness. That was the conclusion that I gave before. But both end in either man-centered individualism. Apart from God, I'm just thinking of myself, either what someone else can do for me or what I can do for myself. Or society, again, taking God out of the picture, we end up with a man-centered utopia. We'll define, they're very different utopias. It's a different vision entirely, but they both become man-centered utopias apart from God. So what does Sheen say instead? So Sheen would say that both our freedom from and our freedom for need to find their fulfillment in God. If we can think not by going to the right or going to the left, but instead he would take both sides and he would bring them up. And so this, I think, is the great vision. It's a two-dimensional, not a one-dimensional vision that Sheen would raise, is that instead of going as far as we can to the left and the right, draw up by going upward toward God, so that way we find the purpose of being free from things. What should we be free from? We should be free from sin, from those corrupting influences. What should we be free for? We should be free for God, to love him and to serve him, and especially those around us. It's only in God that both freedoms find their ideal. Now that Sheen did say in a book called Freedom Under God. So I'm actually quoting him or quoting his thinking in this sense. So what would he say to this world in which we stand today? So how can we draw together both of these things and actually find something that is in common between the two? I would think Sheen would focus on generosity. So what can we do in both cases? The thing is, we should be generously ready to labor and work for ourselves and be mindful of our neighbor. If we can do both of those things, you can actually find common ground, I would suggest, between the right and the left. But it requires putting God at the center of that vision. Between slavery and self-reliance, we want to be free from slavery, but we also want to be self-reliant. Their service. If only we could put forward the idea of serving God and neighbor, we would actually bring together and find kind of a common ground between the two. It does require for God to enter into that picture. Rather than a self-serving or a man-centered utopia, instead what we should be is a nation under God. And again, it doesn't make any sense unless God is at the heart of this discussion. This is just a very quick way for me to pull together a few things that might just give you some thinking about that. One thing that this did for me as I thought about some of these ideas is it actually gave me a greater sense of peace. I think sometimes you turn on the news and you watch or you listen to anyone speaking in terms of politics. What happens? You get anxious. I feel a lot of tension and anxiety that you can sense. It almost seems as if we're talking at such cross purposes. How could the country possibly come together? This actually gives me a greater sense of hope. If we can think about drawing together the best of the principles that the left and the right can share in common and bring them under God for their fulfillment, we can actually, I think, find a much greater and a much more authentic place for harmony. We must remember that social justice, which so often you hear about on the left, and personal justice, which is one of the things you so often hear on the right, they are actually connected, and you can't have one without the other. You cannot have a just society unless it is made up of just persons. This actually is Sheen from his book, Freedom Under God. One cannot be personally just without concern for the welfare of his brothers and sisters in society. So both of those have to go together. So I will finish what I had to say about some of Sheen's political thinking here. And I've also been asked to say just a little bit about the cause for Fulton Sheen. So I'm going to anticipate that that's your first question. So we're starting question and answers now. And I'm going to ask the first question to myself, which is because I think this is, so what is happening with the Sheen cause? And as I say this, if you want to have microphones and whatnot, then I'll take whatever other questions. But I think this is probably one of the fundamental questions. So I'll say this one first. So one of the things that happened in 2019 is that the body of Fulton Sheen moved to the cathedral. And so his body is entombed at St. Mary's Cathedral. And that was also the time at which we had the final approval by Pope Francis of the miracle for his beatification. So Sheen is prepared for beatification. We can beatify Sheen, which is to call him a blessed. It's a step on the way toward canonization by which he would be made a saint. And there's really no reason why he couldn't be beatified as far as the church in Rome is concerned now. And the church in Rome, so the Holy See in Rome, is perfectly satisfied with the case and is prepared to proceed with beatification. The problem is that in the United States, there were some bishops who, and you have to back up a little bit to 2019, were concerned because of especially the state of the church in New York. They were preparing at that moment, they were going to waive the statute of limitations and then allow past accusations of abuse to be brought forward. They were going to start an investigation into the church, much like they did in Illinois and Pennsylvania, so that what's going to come out of that. And the Diocese of Rochester, because of different claims of abuse, this is all unfortunate things, were preparing for bankruptcy. So they said, this is not the time, and who knows who might come forward, who knows what someone might report or accuse or whatnot. It's premature. That was what some of the bishops in New York said. And it was for that reason that there was a delay. What happened afterwards? The statute of limitations was waived, but that was waived for 2 years. No claim was brought forward that in any way impugned Bishop Sheen, which we were confident that was the case. But in fact, we can show nothing was brought forward. Rochester declared bankruptcy. That is working its way through, but the period for presenting claims is over. And no one put forward a monetary claim, claiming some wrongdoing by Bishop Sheen, so that part is clear. And we're waiting for the Attorney General of the state of New York. Let's see, Letitia James. She might be a little preoccupied with another court case, I think, lately. I sense that she's not paying a lot of attention to this particular issue. Technically, that report is still not out, but we know what materials have been provided to the Attorney General's office, and we can actually go through and show in any cases in which so what did Sheen do and how did he handle it? There were 2 cases of priests that he would have dealt with. In both cases, he did the right thing. There was a priest who had abused, and when Sheen was aware of it, he got him out of ministry, and that priest eventually left the priesthood. There was another priest who had past history of abuse who asked to be let back into the Diocese of Rochester, and Sheen would not give him an assignment. And so later, unfortunately, another bishop did accept him back into the diocese, and he, guess what, abused again. But Sheen did the right thing in both cases. He got an abuser out, and he kept another abuser from coming in. In my book, that means Sheen is actually the model for that. So he's the ideal. But at least at the present, or at least from 2019 going forward, there have been some concerns from bishops in New York. So the cause is waiting for either clarity or for a different perspective there, but it's actually, the delay is actually because of bishops in the United States who have voiced their concerns. That's the reason why things have held up. Sheen will be beatified. So as soon as those are overcome, the problem's not in Rome, the problem's in New York. And as soon as that's overcome, then Sheen would be beatified, and that beatification would happen here. And so this is actually one of the reasons why this is actually a great thing for the city of Peoria. So even whether you're Catholic or not, the visitors who already come to Peoria to visit the tomb in the cathedral, the visitors who come to visit the Sheen Museum in the Pastoral Center, who also then stop by and see the other museums and other functions that we have here in town, and who come and stay here in Peoria and visit other things, spend money in Peoria. So this is something that for the entire city, this is actually a very good thing. And his beatification would only multiply all of those different events. So, so that's kind of where things stand right now, and I'll take any other questions. So thank you for your attention. Okay, I kept on time, didn't I? So. And you tell me when we're out of time.
You may have sort of answered it. Why was it important to have his remains here? I mean, he was in New York, that's where he finished. Did he have a desire? Did he say, hey, I want to be buried in New York? Did he not have a desire? Why go through all the effort to bring the remains here?
One of the things that happens when a person is beatified is you actually then want to venerate. Part of the ritual is to venerate the relics. So that either means sometimes you would have a small relic of the person, or sometimes actually the body itself, the place of burial, the body itself is considered a relic. So when people come and they want to celebrate a beatification, they also want to be near the person, which is kind of like the way if you have a loved one and then you're remembering someone who's passed. You know, of course, you can remember your loved one anywhere, but you know, how often would you perhaps go to the cemetery and actually visit your loved one who's buried there? People who want to celebrate the beatification want to be close to Sheen, and so there's a desire for that. The question about where he was buried came up in the court case. I actually read some of the filings on that. He said he wanted to be buried at Calvary Cemetery, which is actually in Brooklyn. And New York vitiated his will when they actually asked for permission to bury him in New York at St. Patrick's Cathedral. So the family said, well, Peoria has done more for the cause. We actually would like him to go to St. Mary's Cathedral. So his wishes were already vitiated because he was not buried where he said in his will. And then, as so often happens in legal circles, you go to the family, and the family is considered the best interpreter of the will of the deceased, so the next of kin. The next of kin was Joan Sheen Cunningham, who's been very supportive, very influential with the cause. She was the one who gave permission for him to be buried at St. Patrick's, and she was the one who made the request that he be moved to Peoria.
So thank you so much for being here. A comment, I've been a member here maybe 35 years or so, and the quality of our speakers is through the roof now. And I just wanted to comment on it. Thank you so much for being here. It was fascinating, so thank you for that. Then I'm going to ask an unfair question.
Sure, go ahead. It's not any fun if the question's easy.
And it's, I don't know how to put it, but Catholicism versus another religion like Protestant or why did you choose one over the other? That is to say, you know, you're a Catholic priest. Why that versus why didn't you become a Protestant minister? Thank you.
Sure. Well, I was baptized Catholic and raised Catholic, so for me that was kind of my natural path. But as far as what I believe about the Catholic Church, for me, so many Christian denominations have the Word of God, which is one of the things that we so often share in common. For the Catholic Church, one of the things that emerges as I think particularly central are the presence of the sacraments, and especially the Eucharist. I've actually been going through a podcast recently that actually quite interestingly is doing a comparison of all of the different Christian denominations and their approach to communion, which has been really fascinating. But for the Catholic Church, the importance of the Eucharist is the real presence of our Lord Jesus Christ, transforming bread and wine into his body and blood, being truly present. That's part of Catholic teaching. For me, that's actually a really important thing. It's and so the notion of participating and sharing in that sacrifice of Christ, which is memorialized sacramentally and then celebrated and represented to us every time the Mass is celebrated. That's a great privilege for me as a priest to be able to offer that sacrifice, for me to be united with it, and then to draw other people to Christ as well. So that would be my personal answer, I think, to that. Others may also have answers too. Run.
I'll be serving coffee at the end of this.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I was speaking of the Eucharist. I was trying to explain to my table about some of the Eucharistic miracles that have occurred around the world, and I did a pretty bad job of explaining it, other than saying like heart, flesh, and the same blood type. So maybe if you could do a better job than I did in explaining that.
There are Eucharistic miracles. Even there's kind of a miracle described in the Gospels themselves that gets the way ready for the Eucharist, and that happens when Jesus multiplies the loaves and the fish. So that's an example of a miracle. That was pales in comparison to the actual miracle of the transformation, not the multiplication of ordinary elements, but the transformation of ordinary things like bread and wine into the extraordinary presence of Jesus' body and blood. So following after that, the Catholic Church has held up different examples of miracles. One of them would be in Orvieto. That's just one I'm familiar with, but there are many in which there is the host itself, which doesn't look any different. And this is one of the things about the Eucharist. It looks like it's still bread. It tastes like it's still bread. It seems to be in all senses still ordinary bread and ordinary wine. And yet sometimes in a Eucharistic miracle, you may have something supernatural occur, like, for example, that host begins to bleed or something like that. There is a corporal, which is one of the cloths on the altar that is kept. And in this particular Eucharistic minister, the host itself began to bleed with human blood. And it fell on the corporal, which was stained. And in Orvieto, they took the corporal, and it is then framed on the in the sanctuary itself, and is a sign. It's a miraculous sign of the reality of what the Catholic Church believes, that the Eucharist is actually the body and blood of Jesus truly present. So the Eucharistic miracle would be something that would be extraordinary, that would be a reinforcing sign, a miracle that confirms that teaching of the Catholic faith. Sheen would say something more profound than that. Thank you.